Great. Do you have something there to drink during our conversation?
Yeah, I'm good.
I do.
Great.
I do.
Okay. So let's start. Hello, everyone. If you are watching us right now, we are sending you greetings, and we are so happy and grateful that you are with us today or tonight. It depends when you're watching. It's my great pleasure, and this is a great opportunity for all of us in the Czech Republic because we are going to have here very, very special guest, very special person for today. I'm going to introduce him to you. And of course, you see here Peter Drulák. You know him very much. So, but first of all, let me say some things before we start. And I will do that in Czech, so sorry guys for that, but I think some people, they do not understand. So you see subtitles, but it's always good to hear that as well. Takže všechny vás tady srdečně vítám v tomto rozhovoru s vzácným hostem, panem Joram Hazony, kterého tady vidíte. Je to autor několika bestsellerů a zároveň také člověk, který má co říci o nacionalismu. Napsal nejenom, že bestseller, ale také se zabývá tímto tématem na akademické úrovni. Já vám o něm řeknu více v angličtině. Ale to, co vám chci teďka říci, také samozřejmě víte Petra Druláka, ale to důležité je, že pod tímto videem máte odkazy na mé dva hosty. Jednak teda na Petra, máte tam také odkazy na pana Hazonyho. Pokud by vás zajímaly knihy právě od mého hosta z Izraele, tak právě teď je jedna z jeho knih přeložená do češtiny. Myslím si, že dokonce 2 knihy. Doporučuji vám se podívat, můžete si je přečíst, já sám bych si je přečetl, kdyby byl v Česku, ale jsou krásně přeložený. Máte tam odkazy, takže se podívejte, můžete si objednat. Zároveň také děkujeme za sdílení dál a všechno to, co vy víte, tyto mezinárodní rozhovory pro vás dělám s velkou láskou. Jsem moc rád, že můžu takhle ze světa pro vás vysílat a zprostředkovávat vám názory dalších odborníků, nejenom z Česka samozřejmě, ale také právě ze světové úrovně. Takže krásně si to užijte. Chci vám moc poděkovat za sdílení dál. V průběhu tohoto rozhovoru tady budete mít titulky, takže můžete číst, anebo zároveň si také užívat angličtinu, pokud tak mluvíte. So thank you very much for your patience, guys. Thank you. So now I'm going to introduce my guests here. So first, Professor, can I say Professor Yoram? Is that okay?
I think probably doctor is better.
Doctor, okay. So Dr. Yoram Hazony is an Israeli-American philosopher and the author of international bestsellers, namely A Virtue of Nationalism or Conservatism, Rediscovery, and many more. Philosopher, Bible scholar, and political theorist. He is also a president of the Herzl Institute in Jerusalem, significant organization. The next, you see Professor Peter Drulák is a prominent Czech political scientist, director of the Institute of International Relations from 2004 to 2013. First, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic from 2014 to 2015. Ambassador of the Czech Republic to France from 2017 to 2019, and the founder of the Patriotic Association of Svobod. So Peter and Yoram, thank you very much for coming. It's again a great opportunity. I hope we are going to have a great time here. So can we hear each other well?
Yes, thank you for the invitation.
Yes, very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Okay, so let's start with that, how it works. I have some questions for both of you, so you can say your opinions. It's from the Czech people who follows me. And it's going to be discussion. We are going to have like 1 hour for each other, and I hope we will finish all the questions. We will see. And I would like to start with one first question, because we are going to talk today about globalism, nationalism, about patriotism, about the changing world we live and principles of understanding our personal role in society. But let me ask the first question before I start with questions from people. What is in interest of many people in my country, Czech Republic, is a situation. In Europe, we are now in situation of conflict in Ukraine right now. There was a cough before and all the restrictions from politicians, and many people got mad about it. And now a new conflict, which partly affected the energetic situation in Europe. Prices are high in the Czech Republic. We are having the most expensive electricity in Europe, even though we are one of the biggest exporters. Our inflation is one of the highest in Europe, maybe highest of all. And naturally, we are having demonstrations against the government and our leaders right now. But the media, doctor, this is for you question. The media and the elites call people on the streets who have the flag, Czech flag, and they sing the national anthems. They call them Russian agents and fake patriots and populists and stupid. It hurts many people because they struggle these days. And you know, what is my question is, it's not happening only in my country. I heard a lot of stories from people from Europe, like from Germany and others, because I'm staying here and I meet travelers. So doctor, why do you think it's happening? Why do the media and elites call these people like that? And do they have a right to judge their patriotism and national feelings? How do you feel about it?
Well, look, it is definitely something that's happening in many countries in the world, and I should say at the beginning, I'm obviously not an expert in Czechia, but so I don't know the particulars of the situation. At the same time, there are some things that all of the Western democracies almost share in common right now, which is the attempt by an extremely aggressive leftist political elite. Until recently, you could call them liberals, but more and more they seem to be cultural Marxists. And among their aims is to subjugate all of the nations of Europe, all of the democratic nations, and ultimately the entire world. That's their dream. Under a rule of their particular ideology. And that ideology, among its aims, is the elimination of patriotic feeling and nationalistic historical consciousness. They're also against religion. They don't like the traditional family. They don't like private property so much either. I mean, they have a very, very a long list of ways in which they want to change us and make us different from what we've been historically. And I personally, I tend to be sympathetic to the patriots and nationalists in every country who want their independence, who want to be able to chart a course for their own people, which might be different from the neighbors.
Thank you very much. Peter, how do you feel about the situation? Do you have this same experience? Do you have the same feeling like Dr. Yoram?
Well, I basically agree with Yoram's analysis, and it brings me to his book, because there are several parts which I find important, with which I agree. There are some parts about which I have some doubts, but speaking about the parts which really resonate with me and which is linked with the events of today. What we see on the part of these, I call them progressivists. Yoram would call them neo-Marxists, I call them progressivists. So these progressivists actually show a very arrogant denial of reality. And it's in many respects. It can be biological reality, it can be strategic reality, it's the denial of the basic feelings the people have. And this denial of reality, and that brings me to Yoram's book, is probably can be linked with certain constructivist reason, because Yoram makes a great case for the empiricist tradition which actually starts with the reality and by trial and error tries to actually somehow live in society. And he contrasts this with the tradition of big rationalist constructions, which often actually, if they do not fit, and these constructions, they may have good reasons, they may have good foundations, but eventually they will clash with reality. But, for the authors of these constructions, it's a problem not of their constructions, it's a problem of reality. So if the construction clashes with reality, the reality needs to change. And that's what we observe today, actually. I mean, these progressivist elites have a very particular construction of reality, which concerns, as I biological nature of people, which concerns the war on Ukraine, which concerns the future of energy. And we see how these constructions clash with reality. And if they see this clash, they say, well, I mean, that's actually bad news for reality. And so we have to do something with the reality. And they actually address a reality which they cannot change. Of course, I mean, we are not under the complete dictate of reality. We are human beings. We can shape it, but we can shape it to a certain degree. And it's not completely voluntaristic. So what we see today is this unbelievable arrogance, which is linked with the human reason, which believes that there are no limits, no limits above, and it can do whatever it wants to. It cannot, and we will pay for it.
Thank you very much for your opinions. Thank all of you for sharing this, because everyone can debate here below the video. Please do that. Write to us your opinions. Even if you do not agree, please write it down. Thank you very much for that. And I'm going to ask you the first question, Yoram, which is here right now. So translation for you is like, how to distinguish a healthy nationalism from a toxic one?
Well, look, we can get lost in arguments about the definitions of words. You know, we can spend all day on it, and I think the important thing is to understand the ideas behind the words and have them clear rather than arguing about the words. So, you know, for example, Peter said progressivism instead of neo-Marxism. And I think he and I very much agree on the idea that we're talking about. So we can set aside the argument about which word fits best. And you know, I would say the same thing. That there are many people who think they don't want to use the word nationalism; they want to use the word patriotism. And I think, again, what's important is that we have the idea clear. The traditional idea of nationalism, which I defend in my writings, it's a principled standpoint that sees the world as governed best when many different nations are independent, when they have the freedom to chart their own course according to their own traditions, their own interests, without it being dictated by other countries. Now, that's not, I don't present this as a utopia. It doesn't, that kind of a theory doesn't solve all of our political problems at all. And of course, there, you know, at the moment that you say that different nations will have different traditions and the freedom to chart their own course, that means that, you know, like every human thing, some of them will be wise and some will be foolish. Some will choose good and some will choose evil. So the claim is not that, you know, that every independent country that and every independent nation will be good. The claim is that on the whole, as mankind is better if we don't place our faith in vast rationalistic constructions of, you know, of a single imperial answer to all the world's problems. And I personally, I think that that the idea of one empire based on one idea is a formula for tyranny, and it almost doesn't matter whether it's a Marxist empire or a liberal empire or a, you know, a Christian empire or a Muslim empire. The very idea that there should be one center that will dictate to all nations is itself a formula for tyranny, and we should do everything we can to avoid it. I think we sure.
Thomas, Thomas, are you lost? Thomas is probably lost.
We've lost Thailand.
Yeah. I hope that he will reestablish the link quite soon. In the meantime, as long as it's recorded, I would just add that I mean, for those of us who believe that the nation is an important value, like Yoram and myself, we really need to think about how to avoid the toxic nationalism, because it can turn toxic, and we have historical examples. For me, the test is actually how do you relate to the others which come from different nations. And I think the nationalism which I support is the one which is open, in the sense that it recognizes the difference, and it believes that this difference is actually hardly bridgeable. From time to time, you may have people changing nations, but it's not usual. It's very unusual, and it's not something which can be done on massive or programmatic way. But it does not mean that you treat foreigners as someone who is a priori inferior to you, and that the foreigner is the enemy to be destroyed. So I think that's, for me, the difference between nationalism which is sound and the one which is toxic. How do you treat foreigner? So liberals actually deny the existence of foreigner, because everybody is basically the same for them. So I think the position which is mine is the recognition of the foreigner. There are people who are part of the nation, and there are people who are outsiders. But you actually treat outsiders with respect, which does not mean that they necessarily become insiders. They are still outsiders, but they are treated with respect, not with the hatred. I think it's something which can be operationalized quite easily.
Okay, the following question for you guys. Okay, let's go back to the Czech Republic. Now we are having a situation when we have a lot of immigrants from Ukraine. Okay, we help them, we gave them support. The question is, if I see that the local people, Czech people, they have problems to find the place for children in the school, or they cannot reach some money, even though they are in a horrible situation right now. And it seems to many people that the treasure is opened to these people who come to Czech Republic for help. Are they these people who are angry about that these people, they have so much support, and some of them can use it, some of them not, of course. We have, every individual has a different approach. But are these people are toxic patriots? Are they too much, in nationalism? Or is it adequate to criticize? Is it good to hear this voice? Or we should say, no, stop doing this? Well, how do you feel about that, Joran?
Well, here also, I very much agree with Petr that there's certainly a condition which is a natural human condition of being curious and generous to people who are different, to people who are strangers, and but after a certain point, people do begin to feel threatened, and sometimes that threat is real, sometimes it's imaginary, and it can lead to hatred. And that hatred, hatred can be justified, and it can be completely unjustified. So you need to look at each case in its particulars. But I think in principle, it's very important to emphasize that there's nothing wrong with a nation wanting to control its borders. There's nothing wrong with a nation wanting to limit the quantity of immigration or the kind of immigration, depending on the economic and cultural needs of the nation. That is part of national independence, and I don't think that in any way rules out the possibility of the same nation that is controlling immigration for internal reasons, of reaching out and helping and building alliances, whether trade or military or other kinds of alliances, with foreign nations that share interests, or sometimes there's just a human sympathy of one nation for another. And what we're looking for always is a decent and humane and reasonable balance, which doesn't go to the extreme of saying I hate people who are different from me, but also doesn't say that I have an obligation to open my country to anyone who wants to come.
Thank you very much. So next question is here. So translation: do you agree with the statement that globalists are trying to eliminate elements of patriotism in individual countries of the world. Joram.
Yes. Well, globalist is another one of those words that people say that you're not allowed to use it. I do use it, and I think there isn't anything in particular wrong with it. When I say globalist, I'm talking about someone who is usually a liberal imperialist. They want to see the entire world, or as much of it as possible, subjugated to a single system of liberal law that will be, based in the EU and the UN and the World Trade Organization, and be imposed by force, usually by American armed forces, with some token representation from Europeans. And this globalist theory, I think it is pernicious. I think it's a warmongering ideology, which leads to the attempt to export liberalism to places like Iraq and Somalia and Afghanistan, and even to the Ukraine, where liberalism is not a local national tradition. And if you want to force these kinds of countries to become liberal, you're going to have to do it not just through a bribery, but through the imposition of a globalist tyranny. I also think that organizations like the leading globalist spokesmen are people like the World Economic Forum, and they're even more radical about on the one hand thinking that borders, nations are something that need to be completely overcome, and they combine that traditional fantasy of liberal internationalists with these new fantasies of a post-human future where they're going to be manufacturing better brains and better bodies for a small elite. I mean, all sorts of crazy things coming out of these globalist organizations. And as was said before, it is a detachment from reality. It's an unwillingness to accept for example, the limitations of human reason, our own inability to understand what is happening in a foreign country like Afghanistan, to understand what those people want and what they need. If you are aware that we're limited in our intellectual powers, in our military powers, then I think you become immediately skeptical of these kinds of world-embracing ideologies, and you start thinking, well, maybe we should try to concentrate our efforts more on our problems at home than on the other side of the world.
Yes, well, if I can add to this, for me, what is globalism? Behind the globalism, I see actually alliance of three rather distinct forces. First, you have actually utopians which come with all kinds of globalist utopias, like this post-human utopia or cosmopolite utopia of having like one world ruled from one center. I mean, these guys have been here for centuries. So that's one group. That's sort of liberalism at its best, I would say, or at its worst, depending on how you see it. Then you have big international investors. I mean, big international investors who need a smooth circulation of goods, people, money around the globe. They don't need any patriotism, because patriotism is an obstacle to this circulation. So that's the second group. And then the third group are actually American imperialists. Those who believe actually that USA should be the center of the world and that the world should turn American. So these three groups are actually hidden behind this label of globalism: utopians, big investors, and American imperialists. And none of these groups would have any respect for any local patriotism or nationalism, because it's a complicated factor. it's something actually which destroys or at least disturbs their plans. So in this respect, I think that's why actually it's very necessary to really clean this idea of nationalism from its past toxic additions, and to say nationalism is not about war. It's not about actually destroying other people. It's actually about defending your own community and your own way of life against these three threats: utopian, big financial interests, and American imperialists.
What came to my head is, like, you mentioned your Ukraine. So do you think that the result of war, which is now taking place there, is a result partly of the different ideology inside, like that there were attempts to deliver some kind of ideology which for Russia is unacceptable? Like, no way, you will not go this way. That's why we have such a problem with you right now. Some people, they think that. Many people, they think about it. Many people, they criticize this idea. So what do you think about it?
Well, look, there are many different factors, and I don't want to be too simplistic about this. I think that the Russians, both have they both have an imperialist tradition, which goes back many centuries, and I'm sure that's at play. At the same time, the Russians also have, this has been, discussed endlessly, but the Russians also, that they have their own security interests and their own understanding of what threatens them, and the fact that that I wouldn't want to live in Russia, and that I don't like the Russian regime especially, does not mean that that the Russians don't have actual interests that motivate them. They do have interests that you can understand, and I think that that the European and American enthusiasm for the Ukraine war, it's a combination of things, because on the one hand, there is a very real globalist motive. I would say that all three of the globalist groups that we were just discussing are enthusiastic about this war, each one for their own reasons. But at the same time, there are many people who are not globalists at all. You can be a nationalist. For example, many of my Polish friends, they're clearly Polish nationalists, and still they support Ukraine because they correctly fear Russian expansionism and Russian imperialism. And they think an independent Ukraine would be better for Polish national interests. So I don't think supporting the Ukraine war makes you necessarily a globalist. You could be a globalist or a nationalist and support the Ukrainians. But I think that the utopian aspect of this is dominant. The main voices that we hear speaking about Ukraine in America and in Europe are that they're not nationalist, and they're not thinking clearly about interests. They're ideological. They have decided, contrary to reality, that Ukraine is a liberal democracy, and that it's fighting the fight for universal liberalism. I think it's completely disconnected from reality, and it's going to lead us. It is leading us to a catastrophe.
Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, I understand the Ukrainian conflicts in terms of power. I mean, I see there the American expansion trying to shift the NATO borders to the Russian border, to the Ukrainian-Russian border. So there is a clear, actually, grab for power from the part of the United States, trying actually to make use of the Russia's weak position. And then you have actually the Russian backlash, which is actually traditionally quite brutal. I mean, Russia is a brutal great power, no doubts about that. But the starting point was this expansion of the American interests. So what we see now is the clash of two imperial interests: American imperial interest, Russian imperial interest, and Ukrainians have a bad luck that they are in between, and that's with their life, their country, their infrastructure that they are paying for all of this. So for me, the ideological dimension is rather secondary. Ideology then plays a great place, an important role in the propaganda, because we are immersed in an enormous, actually, propaganda of lies coming from all the sides. So it's very difficult to have a clear picture of what's going on there. But the basic, for me, the basic logic is the logic of power. There is one power which was expanding, and the other power which was reacting with its traditional brutality.
I should really add, when we're talking about American imperialism, that of course there really is such a thing, but usually the American imperialists today are liberal. They're liberal imperialists. They equate America with liberalism, and then they say, we should export this to the world. It's interesting that the conservatives and the political right, the nationalists in the United States, are almost none of them can be called imperialists. The main force today in American politics for restraining this kind of imperialism and adventurism and supporting endless American wars overseas, the main force is figures like Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, Josh Hawley, J.D. Vance. All of these are figures on the American political right or intellectually the Heritage Foundation. These are conservatives. And they're opposed to empire because they are nationalists. They think that it's not in America's interest to be expending its resources, attempting to expand throughout the world.
Well, that's an important point, and it's like with the war in Vietnam in the 1960s. This was actually started by the Kennedy administration, which was full of this bright progressivist people. And it was then phased out or ended by the Nixon administration, which was sort of more conservative. So, the only exception, or the big exception, is the birth of so-called neoconservatism, which has nothing to do with conservatism, actually, in my reading. It's actually quite wrong to put them into conservative family, because most of them are actually former Trotskyites or Maoists or whatever. And they just they keep the same structure of thinking, and they just change the contents a bit. So neoconservatism is very expensive. That's George Bush Jr. And they can be actually good friends with progressivists in Democratic Party. So Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and George W. Bush, they are in one family. And on the other side, you may have people like Trump, part of the Republican Party, but also some parts of the Democratic Party who are actually not expansionist and not imperialist.
Yoram, would you add something, or we can go to following question?
Yeah, okay. I don't want to dig too deep again into these labels, but just when we talk about neoconservatives, I feel an obligation to my teacher, Irving Kristol, who was the original neoconservative, who very clearly, he today would have been a national conservative, and if you read his writings, he was very, very, very clear about Europe should defend itself, and humanitarian utopianism is absurd, and America does not have business invading other countries. And he was absolutely clear on these things. But you're right that the second generation of neoconservatives are very, very good friends with the liberal internationalists and the utopian globalists. They're all one big family, just as you say.
Just one notice, back to your book. You dedicate a small chapter to Leo Strauss there. Leo Strauss actually, and you explain actually that he was actually one of those who created this Cold War consensus which contaminated conservative thought. And Leo Strauss actually is one of the prophets of these of the second generation neoconservatives.
I have much more to say about Leo Strauss, but let's go on to the next question.
Guys, the books which are mentioned here by Peter, the books he read are down below the video. There are links in Czech. It was translated, so you can read it very easily. So if you want, you can check it. So next question for you is here. So translation: do you think that European Union will survive? How does its development over time affect you? So how do you think about their development? Do you like it, Yoram, or do you think it's just becoming some bullshit? Sorry.
Okay. Well, look. I don't have a crystal ball, so I'm not going to try to answer the question whether it's going to survive or not. But do I like it? No, I do not like it. I think that since the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, the European Union has become not only increasingly aggressive in suppressing the national independence and freedom of European nations, but it's also an exporter of anti-national ideology. There really is a network of liberal internationalists, of globalists. By the way, there's also thank goodness there's also a growing network of nationalists from different countries who are working together. But the Europeans really are, in many respects, the leaders, the world leaders of the network of liberal internationalists seeking to suppress national independence. And all you need to do is, look at the thuggish way, the brutal way in which the European Union, which is it's primarily a creature of the German government and a tool of the Germans with some help from French and Belgians. But look at the way that that it interferes in choosing who is going to be in the government in Italy, or managing the economy of Greece, or interfering in the judicial concerns of the Polish government, or immigration concerns of the Hungarians. It's just a terrible institution. It's terrible in principle because it suppresses the freedom of nations. But in practice, we also see that it's almost always simply a force for opposition to freedom, opposition to national traditions, opposition to religious traditions. What's good about it? What should we like about it?
I used to be a great supporter of the European Union. I mean, for my generation in the 1990s, that was sort of a European dream of joining this great European construction, being together and creating something in Europe which could resist actually the external forces. Unfortunately, what the European Union has been representing in the last decades are actually very far away from this dream. It turned too ideological, too intrusive, and it's this anti-nationalism Yoram is spoken about. It's actually very dangerous. It's at odds with the profound European traditions. So there are too much in this utopian construction, which, as I said, inevitably it will clash. It will clash. So I would not bet too much actually on the future of the European Union, because you could say actually it can be reformed. I think it cannot. It's like with the Soviet Union. It's of course, I mean, it's at certain point, the structures cannot be reformed too much. And once you start reforming them, it's usually their end. So Yes, it's a huge disappointment for my generation, I would say, because for us, obviously, we need in Europe to have a structure which would put us together. Because if we stay completely divided, it's not good. But it cannot be the structure which is the Brussels of today.
Let me just say something about this idea of being completely divided. Look, in reality, when we speak about national independence, we're talking about the freedom of the Czech people to be able to make decisions of what is in their interest. Now, that doesn't mean that outside of the European Union that the Czechs will not seek military and economic alliances that will be to the advantage of Czechia, because obviously they will. You know, regardless of what your view is of the Ukraine crisis, I think it's obvious, and it's been obvious, you know, for a very long time that Eastern European countries, they have security interests. They have a mutual security interest. They have threats from the east. They have threats also emanating from the south, from the Islamic world, and Czechia is not, you know, it can't defend itself alone. It's not going to defend itself alone. Mm-hmm. It has to be part of a broader alliance that seeks the security of the Czech people and the Czech Republic, and that can also go for economic questions. Where this idea of an alliance becomes absurd is when you create a central government, which instead of, you know, serving the different nations, that central government becomes the dictator to those nations. It starts replacing their currency. It starts replacing their laws. It starts deciding, you know, who is enlightened and who is not, and punishing them for whether they're enlightened. That's the problem. You know, no nationalist thinks that, you know, that countries can be, you know, entirely isolated and not collaborate with other nations. Of course, we all want to collaborate with other nations where we share interests and a common culture and common affections.
Well, for us, the challenge now is actually to find the right way of collaboration, because at certain point, I believe we can expect a profound crisis of the EU. And the question is whether this collaboration, which is actually good for Czechia, will be on the continental scale, like European, or regional scale, like Central European. So right now, I'm actually more believer in the Central European structures, which would respect the sovereignty of its participants and which would make it possible to overcome their obvious actual limitations and weaknesses.
Right, and I think that, you know, just to touch on the question of conservatism, it's those Eastern European countries are in many respects, including Czechia, are in many respects much less persuaded of liberalism and liberal internationalism and liberal utopianism than France and Germany are, or even Britain. But we can see an opportunity if there were to be a Central European alliance of the kind that you're talking about. I think that in addition to being a very substantial power in its own right, it would be very attractive to countries like Italy and Israel, the national conservatives in the United States and in Britain. They would see that as a very attractive partner, you know, both for foreign policy and security cooperation and for economic reasons. That it could be something very, very, very interesting and attractive to other nations, you know, well beyond Eastern Europe.
Together with a couple of friends, actually, I cooperate in the association which is called Saint Adalbert, which is our common saint actually in the Central Europe, and we try to develop exactly what you are talking about, Joram. That's actually our idea.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys, for your answers. Thank you very much for your time. And now this is the next question. So Lucie Jenčíková is asking, has patriotism ever been so comprehensively suppressed in history? If so, what were the consequences? If not, how to understand it now?
Well, sure. Patriotism is always suppressed by empire. You know, the Roman Empire and the Babylonian Empire and the Assyrian Empire, they were all about suppressing the patriotism of the nations that they conquered. And you know, much more recently, the Bolsheviks, I mean, meaning the Soviet Union and its empire, was all about suppressing national and religious traditions of different peoples and family structures, as traditional family structures as well, because these are the great levers of resistance to empire. Nation, religion, family, community, those are the things that make it possible for human beings to gather strength and resist the tyranny of empire. So empires always seek to destroy these things to one degree or another, and the Soviets were, you know, absolutely hostile to the patriotism of, you know, the dozens of peoples over which they ruled. And what was the result? The result was that an explosion of nationalism the moment that the Soviet Union began to become weak. And I depending on how history goes, I mean, it looks like the European Union is going in the same direction, that it is increasingly Bolshevik in its suppression of nationalism and patriotism and national independence, and it may end up like the Soviet Union in all sorts of ways.
Well, if you look actually at the Czech history, we have actually several stages of quite brutal suppression of the Czech identity. I mean, the 17th century, after the World War, after the 30 Years' War, when the Habsburg actually started their sort of eradication of all non-Catholic faiths, which was actually against the Czech Brethren and other Protestant actually denominations. Then at the turn of the 18th century, again, Austria with actually Enlightenment, because Enlightenment absolutism was against national languages. It was no longer about religion, because they were not Catholic at all. But they considered Czech language a complication. So for them, it was something which actually should not be supported. So this is this Austrian imperial moment. Then the Soviet imperial moment, it was complicated, because at start in the 1950s, it was really brutally anti-national identity. But then you have actually you have the experience of national communism. Then actually, I mean, even after 1968, I mean, this country was part of the Soviet Empire, but patriotism, or the idea of being Czechoslovak at that time, not Czechoslovak, was actually quite promoted. And the idea of being proud of being part of that country in the 1970s and 1980s. I mean, when I grew up, that was not like dirty work, being patriot. No, that was something which was actually promoted. So this Bolshevism had actually also several stages. What we experience now from Brussels is actually much harsher, much more anti-patriotic than the communism in the 1970s and the 1980s. I don't compare with the 1950s. Yeah, that's a different story. So yes, it's a steady struggle. Whenever you have an empire, when you have a centralized power, any kind of patriotism, apart from the patriotism of the ruling elite, they can be patriots. Apart from this patriotism, they will suppress everything.
Peter, I'm curious. Why do you begin so late? Is the example of the Hussites, and is that not a legitimate example?
Well, it's a good question. Yeah, I could have started much earlier. There was actually, if you go back to the 10th century, there was actually a struggle with the German bishops. I mean, like the local. They were either pagans, there were pagan religions, and actually local Christians, which had their own tradition, which goes back to Cyril and Methodius, which is like a Slavic church. And this Slavic church actually clashed with the Holy Roman Empire. So that was, and we are now in that's the 10th, 11th century. And then, of course, you have a Hussite revolution, which was like the attempt to develop our own sort of a Czech way to the Christianity. Like in the 1960s, we had our own Czechoslovak way to socialism. So in the 14th century, in the 15th century, it was a Czech way to Christianity. Yes, I mean, we could have talked about this for 1 hour. I was just brief because of our time limitation.
No, but you know, one of the wonderful things about, you know, people assume that that if you're a nationalist, it means that you don't respect and even love other nationalisms. And I find, you know, my colleagues and I, we organize these national conservatism conferences, and we meet nationalists from all over Europe and all over the world. And one of the wonderful things is how much nationalists from different countries have in common. And you know, I've learned so much about the history of Polish and Hungarian nationalism since I started running these conferences, and my book started appearing in these countries, because you meet educated Eastern Europeans who say, you know, what are you talking about? You know, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was not anti-nationalist. It was the German Catholic Church that was anti-nationalist, because they wanted to suppress all the Slavs. And so look, this is something that I didn't know anything about, and it's very, very worthwhile to learn the history of nations from the people who care most about it, because there are all these facts that simply get suppressed in the very simplistic views that we're fed.
No, that's an important point, because in our history we try to apply sort of a balance of power, trying to balance this power of German bishops and archbishops against the power of the Rome. So the Rome was often seen as an ally, which was not the case during the Hussite Revolution, of course, but for many centuries before it was the case. And as you said, you know, I mean, if true patriots or nationalists meet, they should understand that they are not there to convert one another, that they have their own traditions, and that's actually they meet in mutual respect. Unlike progressivism, which actually believes in this one universal creed, and unless you subscribe to that creed, then there must be some problem with you. So that I do not expect this kind of attitude from conservative people.
So guys, that's why you are here. Thank you very much for explaining and sharing your ideas. I'm going to do next question. Going to read it for Yoram. So the next question: do you think there is one globalist elite, or are there multiple elites groups that each have a slightly different agenda? Yoram, what do you think about it?
Well, Petr already addressed this. I think he did a very fine job in distinguishing three different flavors or strands of globalists. You know, I think everything he said is true, and yet at the same time, you know, the internal disagreements among globalists are not strong enough to prevent them from being a unified force, you know, against nationalists, against national independence, against national traditions and interests, and so, you know, I think if you're a scholar studying it, then you know, scholars divide things into many different strands correctly, but if you're looking at it, just, you know, sometimes simplicity is the easiest way to understand the truth about something. And the simple answer is that these global elites, despite their internal disagreements and debates, they are united on most of the major issues that face us, and that unfortunately is the reality.
Yeah, I would like to stress that there is no single center of power. Yeah, that's important. I mean, that it's really the power is much more dispersed than we could imagine. And despite the fact that there is some sort of coordination, I wouldn't overestimate their ability to coordinate. So in this, I'm perhaps a bit more optimistic than Yoram, because I believe that their internal differences are real. Because after all, you know, they tend to compete against each other. And this force of competition, of the globalized capitalism competition, is something which is likely to divide them. So in this respect, yeah, it's a network, definitely. They are able to coordinate. On the other hand, their internal differences are profound enough, actually, to make them actually quite weak at certain moment, once the moment comes.
Thank you very much. Next question is here. What are the plans of the globalist groups? What do you think? Jarmila Švadlenková is asking.
Well, I think we've mostly covered it. Setting aside the fact that there are internal disagreements, obviously, we're talking about a movement towards imposing a single rule of law on all nations in the world, which then has to be enforced in some way. And that enforcement, at the moment, it has to rely on American military power, because that's where the military power is. But you can imagine other configurations at other times. That's what we're seeing right now. Let me say something about European power, because I think it's kind of missing from the discussion. I think that the United States has made a terrible mistake. Made a terrible mistake in continuing its authority and effective control over European security after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that mistake is on several fronts. First of all, there's a problem with American security guarantees detaching Europeans from reality. Now, I understand that in part this was the Americans were afraid of a resurgent Germany and all sorts of other things that you could name that might be reasons to be of interest for this kind of policy. But the ultimate fact is, with hindsight, is that the Americans detached the European elites from responsibility for their own security, which means from funding their security, from building militaries, from executing and implementing security concerns. And the result is that the Americans have been funding a utopian ideology in Europe, which naturally grows in a place where the leading people don't know anything about how to secure their own their own interests. And this has created this kind of hothouse for the development of aggressive globalist ideas, which are really fantasies, which then is exported back to the United States through American academia, which has close ties to European academia. And look, this has just been a terrible mistake. And I've been telling, my European friends for many years that the only way out of this is ultimately going to be for Europeans to take responsibility for their own security. I mean, there's other reasons to do that now, because America's principal problem is not Russia. America's principal problem is China, and the Americans are. It's unclear whether America is capable of competing with China, because its elites constantly focus on side issues. But Russia's not a side issue for Europeans, and neither is immigration or security problems for the Islamic world. And so the direction of back to reality has to be for the Europeans to begin to send their boys to the military, to tax themselves in an appropriate level in order to be able to take care of their own security concerns, and that means freeing themselves from this dependence on the United States, which in the end is not good for Europe and it's not good for America.
Well, I agree with that completely, and even this it's sort of a greenhouse effect which you described. I mean, Europeans like growing in a protected greenhouse, and which makes it possible for them to behave in an irresponsible way, believing that the American uncle will take care of all this. But it's also the problem. It's really the problem of Americans that they have always been schizophrenic. They have always been in two minds actually about Europe, because on the one hand, they kept complaining that it's costly for them actually to have these troops in Europe and to take care of the European security. So that was like this direction for withdrawal, and now you have grown up and do your own job. That was one state of mind. But then there was the other state of mind, which was saying, well, we have invested quite a lot into Europe. It's quite actually good to have the control over them, because I mean, if we leave, who knows what will happen? They may be friends with Russia, they may be friends with China. We don't need that. So that's, I think, always, so the Americans were urging Europeans, well, be more responsible, do something yourself. And when Europeans started to do that, they said, well, it's against our interest, you shouldn't do that. So it will require also, I mean, a very deep self-reflection on part of Americans. But it's true that this is the job for Europeans. Europeans should do it. And I believe in this respect that the war in Ukraine can be perhaps the moment when Europe starts this self-reflection, because what's going on there in the last year, it's very deeply against the European interests. It may be actually more in line with American or British interests, but not with European interests. So at certain point, even the European elites may start to understand that.
Yeah, unfortunately, asking deep self-reflection from anybody is a very it's a very tall request. So I hope the Europeans will not wait until Americans have achieved deep self-reflection to begin this process of freeing themselves.
I have to ask before we follow, Yoram, in respect to your time schedule, do you have like 15 more minutes for questions, or are you done with time, because we are now broadcasting for 1 hour?
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't have a clock in front of me, so no. Okay. We should stop now. And I, like I said, I'm very interested now that the conservatism book is out in Czech. I would like to encourage people to read it. So if you want to continue on a different occasion, we can do that.
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much for your time. It was a great honor having you here. And of course, you, Peter Drulák, it is not our first interview, but thank you very much for your time as well. And we have here like 7 questions. So guys, if you're willing to continue, I can contact with your assistants, and we can arrange some more meeting to finish the interview if you are willing to, if you have time. So I will let you know. And people, you were watching us. Thank you very much for sharing this. Thank you very much for comments, for, if you are here, new, subscribe for new interviews. Thank you very much. And down to the below the video, you can find links to books which were mentioned here many times. The Yoram books, so you can find it in Czech right now, so you can read it and continue with this investigation in your own time. And Peter Drulák, you can find there some links as well. So thank you very much to all of you. Without your support, people, it wouldn't be here, because we are not big media. We are just like some alternative media. And thank you very much for your support again. So guys, Yoram, to you, I wish you all good luck with your work, with everything you do. Thank you very much. It's a great opportunity. Thank you. And Peter, again to you, follow your dreams and everything you do. Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure to meet both of you. And
Thank you. Nice to meet you. Goodbye.